Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Sociastrology. Today I wanted to go through the Mars conjunct Uranus transit from a historical perspective. So, going through some of the last times that this has happened and what has come up during those periods of time so that we can kind of understand this one that is coming up. It doesn't quite look as bad as one might expect, but some of them have been pretty weird. So we'll go through those one by one, just doing the last few. And yeah, if you do like this content, then please do give it a thumbs up. I very much appreciate and cherish all of that. And if you want to discuss this further, if you have any questions or you know of any other Mars conjunct Uranus or even other Mars hard aspect to Uranus transits that have been quite interesting, please feel free to leave that in the comments down below. I would love to discuss all of that. And if you're into this kind of content, then do subscribe, join our community so that we can see each other on future episodes. And yeah, without any further introduction, let us first dive into the Mars conjunct Uranus that's coming up and then go through some of our previous instances of this transit. Okay, so for our upcoming conjunction, we have this taking place on the 15th. That's a Monday. I have this set for my time, which is it's in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's Central Daylight Time at 8:50. This is weird. I don't know why it says +5. I'm actually -5 UTC. So you will probably, unless you are on the West Coast, be adding hours on in order to get this to your time. I am going to use the whole sign system just to look at this. We won't dive into the chart too much. I mostly want to cover in this episode, because I've been talking about these different aspects in the monthly and some of the other videos that we've done recently. I want to talk about this from more of a conceptual standpoint as far as this one is concerned, and then I have a couple that I definitely want to cover because I went back and I looked at when have we last had Mars Uranus conjunctions in late Taurus. So Uranus has, I believe it's an 84-year cycle. So what we would want to look at is when Uranus was in Taurus and the late degrees. So it's in the third decan of Taurus. I'll go into why that is. Um, and then Mars coming back around to join it. Because one thing that's important to know about this aspect is it's not the rarest. It's just that it won't be occurring in this location for a very long time. Um, and the sign that the planets are in is definitely quite significant here. So, what else did I want to say on that real quick? The two dates that we're going to be kind of focusing in on in the past will be around the few months around March 1st, 1942, and then previous to that, the last time that it happened was May 6th of 1857, and we'll dive into those and see what happened around those times here in a minute. Now, possibly the most significant thing that we should really look at. Oh yeah, I do want to mention. So this just generically Mars conjunct Uranus transits. These will happen every couple of years. Mars has an approximately 2-year cycle, so that means that it's going to hit all of the planets within about 2 years. It does have slow periods and quick periods, but it makes a go around the sun every couple of years. So we do see these every once in a while, and they tend to have kind of the effect that you would expect. But I want to focus in on the Taurus themes because those are really going to pop up during this time, especially third decan Taurus. So overall, some of the things that we want to look for, if we're looking for the bad that can come from this, if we're looking for the cautions that can come with this would lead to shock and surprise. It would lead to rash action and impatience. It could cause accidents, or at least be concurrent with it. You know, if you want to say that correlation isn't causation, but these are things that we would expect to see during this time. Violence would also pop up with this. Any sort of explosions or electrocution would pop up with this. And again, we're looking at the bad. We'll look at the good in a sec. So a contrarian type of rebelliousness. So rebellion for the sake of it. Although we'll see also rebellion for cause in the past. There's definitely rebellion for cause in these past two really interesting time periods that we have for past transits. Another thing is, you know, destruction of well-made plans, and we'll go into that a bit more in a second here too, but also intense storms, potential for earthquakes and volcanoes, especially because of the fact that this is taking place in Taurus. So one thing we want to keep in mind with this is Taurus rules the land itself. It also rules just under the land. So subterranean themes, not quite as much as, you know, a kind of plutonic archetype of the underworld, but just subterranean, just the soil and the earth. So things that can also come through there. So you could see potentially volcanic activity or earthquake activity as those things are coming up from, you know, the plates of the earth. That is one thing that I will certainly be looking at. I've actually seen a little bit more activity recently as far as that goes. There have been a couple of volcanic events, I want to say within the past week or so, as we're getting closer to this perfection of the conjunction. This is definitely, if you are into any sort of spell work or anything like that, this is not really a time to dabble. I kind of can't emphasize that enough. Even if you know what you're doing, um, if you're trying to encapsulate this energy into something, make sure that it is a really concentrated, for instance, item that you can really put away and that you can clear, because there's so much potential for accidents with this. If you had any sort of item that you tried to put this energy into, then it could cause, uh, you know, extreme injury, you know. So definitely not really, in my opinion, the time to dabble in spells or anything at all. That actually pops up as a tendency of this degree, this 26 of Taurus degree, um, from Corelli and Cherubel. They both kind of mention a tendency to dabble in that. So I would personally avoid that entirely. There's also going to be an independent, kind of fearless tendency with this. There's going to be a lot of inventiveness that goes along with this, especially based on the degree. That's another thing that comes up with many authors who are speaking about this 26 of Taurus degree. And then the fact that it is Mars and Uranus that are at that point really emphasizes that energy a lot. So there's probably going to be some major breakthroughs that various people have throughout this time, especially on this day when they're both at 26, that are going to result in some really interesting inventions or innovations, ways of doing things that they previously hadn't thought of. And it'll probably come through as these kind of sudden breakthroughs or these kind of epiphany moments, you know, the light bulb moment. This is a strongly inspiring transit as well. This is a point of a lot of inspiration as to what you are wanting to channel your energy into. There's one reason that people are, I and pretty much any other astrologer who's going to talk to you about this transit, it's going to be really emphasized the physical channel of energy that's represented by these planets is that's it's such a strong feature of both of them. And then the fact that it's in this earthy physical sign of Taurus really emphasizes that as well. So there's going to be a lot of inspiration and wanting to channel your physical and spiritual and mental energy into something that you find exciting. So yeah, excitement, delight. There's also probably going to be, I think that the Olympics are about to start, and so this should be really interesting for that. There's also I think it's on the 15th, is the home run derby in Major League Baseball. So I'm expecting some really cool stuff out of those because major feats of body and mind and strength are represented by these two planets, and again, especially in Taurus because it's such a physical sign. There's also a major influence of speed from this aspect. Mars wants to do things quickly, and Uranus represents instantaneousness. So there's any sort of drag upon the actual accomplishment of something that someone's putting their energy into that is represented by time of any sort is going to feel like a major imposition. So time itself will be a frustration with this. The fact that any time has to elapse at all, and the more time, the more frustrating. So yeah, there's going to be a major urge to break free with this aspect as well. This could definitely manifest as a really extreme case of the Mondays, considering that's when this is occurring. You really might not want to work during this time. So if you do still have time to, request off and you're thinking that that's something that might pop up, then I would definitely do that during this time. Now, we've done the good, we've done the bad, getting into the ugly aspect of this. Another major aspect about the specific degree that this is taking place on is that this is the degree, I want to say it's actually at 27 of Taurus, is Algol, which is a fixed star. It comes from, I think it's Ras Al Ghul in Arabic, which is the head of the demon. It is within the constellation of Perseus, and basically the way that the constellation is laid out is there's Perseus is, you know, a constellation of stars, and then he's holding the severed head of Medusa, and this is the main star of the head of Medusa within that constellation. So it carries the energies of that specific um, archetype there. So this star is also in Chinese lore. I think it's associated with some constellation. I think they're called mansions. And I'm gonna completely butcher this, but I'll try and pronounce it. It's Tai Shi, which is T-S-E-I-H, separate word S-H-E. And it means piled up corpses. So again, there's this kind of mortal, uh, a kind of grotesque energy to the the archetype that's being represented generally. The star that this is as well, Algol, is actually an eclipsing binary. So every few days there's 8 hours where this star actually appears dimmer than it otherwise does because the fainter star, the weaker star of the binary system actually eclipses the other one from our point of view. And so the whole star becomes a lot dimmer during an approximately 8 hour period. every few days, and a lot of old like leaders within um, the various caliphates and so forth who were relying on the astrologers that they had. They wouldn't start, I think there was one in particular, but I'm completely forgetting his name. They wouldn't start wars during the time where this star appeared more faint. Um, so there's also an energy here within the Perseus constellation generally. There's a representation of strength and boldness and adventurousness. We can also see that again with these two planets. Those are energies that they both hold as well. It also can have influence over events which are affecting the masses, like masses of people, as well as specifically major weather events. But there is a drawback to Perseus as a whole, as a constellation, which has a much more pleasant influence than specifically Algol, because again, Perseus has slain Medusa, is holding her head, and that's the star that we're talking about. But the constellation broadly has much more pleasant influences, but it does also represent a level of dishonesty. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some of that come through as well with all of this energy. Otherwise, the star is associated with misfortune, with violence, with matters, violence especially affecting the head, of course, because this is the severed head that we're talking about within the context of this constellation. Electrocution also comes up, which is fascinating because I had that specifically for Mars-Uranus itself, but it also comes up with the star, as well as mob violence. And this is considered by most authors, classical, medieval authors, and also modern authors, speaking of the energies of the fixed stars. This one's considered the most evil star by pretty much most or all authors. So that's one reason why whenever I mention this conjunction, I keep mentioning that it's happening on this star, because that is really significant here. Now, I also want to talk about the decan that this is taking place in. So Taurus and all of the signs also carry three faces or decans, and this one is taking place within a Saturn-ruled decan. It's the first Saturn-ruled decan in the order of the zodiac, starting from Aries. We haven't yet had a Saturn-ruled decan. The decan is strongly associated with the Seven of Pentacles in tarot, so you can kind of think of it that way, where we have a Saturnian energy combined with Taurus. So very much concerned with earthly matters, with matters of investment and prosperity, the energy that you're putting in, the energy that you're getting out, that return on investment there. So the Seven of Pentacles comes up with it, definitely makes a lot of sense, especially in terms of potential destruction of well-made plans. Because if you were to think of this entire situation with, say, this kind of Uranian influence, that would be the Tower card. I mean, if you're thinking of Tower card and Seven of Pentacles, it's like just something kind of blowing up some well-made plans there, which is a very fascinating, slightly unnerving kind of influence. But one important thing to keep in mind here is this isn't going to impact everyone in the most extreme manner. The vast majority of people, probably, this will just maybe annoy, it might give you a sense of impatience. It might have you seeing more accidents on the road, hopefully not participating in them. It could have the news get weird. It could have some shocking events happen in the world that might be a little unsettling. But as far as your own personal life, any sort of transit, the likelihood of it actually representing, for instance, a tower moment within your own personal life, um, to borrow a term from tarot, it's not that likely that it's going to completely disrupt everyone's life. And if it were to, it would probably be in a means of like a large internet outage or something like this, where it's not the end of the world. So when I'm saying these kind of extreme things, these will probably be things that come out of this, but it's not going to affect everyone, you know. Now, I do want to point out that notice how I have this set for Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm pretty much smack in the middle of the United States. So throughout the whole US, this is taking place in the upper part of the chart. Um, and in the central US, it is very much culminating. It's coming toward the top of the chart here. Now, on the East Coast, I did notice that Jupiter is at the very top of the chart, but these two are also very high. If you go toward the West Coast, they'll drop down a little bit, but they're still going to be pretty high in the chart. In Europe, this is going to be setting, so it's going to be on the descending point here. Um, so any sort of significations you might want to pull from that, you can. It's also going to be in Australia rising here. Um, and that's going to be actually on the 16th of July, because, you know, y'all always do your dates differently than us because you're so far away. Um, Now that means that, for instance, also even in Moscow, so all the way to Eastern Europe, we're talking it's setting. So the in between, India and Central Asia and so forth, with the exception of extreme East Asia, will be moving up. It's going to be actually at the bottom of the chart here. So I would say in terms of areas that it's going to most be impacting, it will definitely have a huge influence in the US, and then it should have some interesting effects for instance, Europe, as well as potentially in Australia. So let's see, what else do I have real quick as far as, let's go into the aspects real quick. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, and then we'll go into the historical um, kind of instances that I've pulled up for this. One thing, probably the most significant thing that I want to point out, is that it's actually not an aspect that's occurring when this is sharply perfected, but the moon is in Scorpio. It's in the early degrees at the point when this is exact. It is going to be opposing this point of conjunction and will be opposing both of the planets the following day. So this would be probably getting into the 17th in Australia and then the 16th everywhere else, other than Far East Asia, you know. So the following day after this occurs, the moon will be opposing this point. That's going to be a major trigger point again. It's probably going to be just as significant in terms of the energy that comes out of this as the perfection of the aspect itself. It's going to highly sensitize and really, really heighten the energies that are already taking place here. It's also going to ground this down even more within our everyday lives and our everyday experiences. So this may feel like a whirlwind that gets pretty annoying by the next day, because obviously it's going to take some time for this to kind of dissipate as an energy. As far as the continual energy that we're feeling from it, I would say it's going to take Mars moving into Gemini before we really start to feel it let up. Um, and I want to say, when is that? That's going to be about the 20th of July that that Mars is finally going to move into Gemini. So we've got several days of this really playing out. Another thing that will be taking place during this time will be the Republican National Convention will also be taking place throughout this week. So we also have we have two sextile aspects essentially coming off of this, one to the Sun and one to Neptune, and they're both applying. We do also have this trine to Pluto, but this is a little farther off, and for this influence, for this kind of deep, heavy power influence kind of energy of Pluto to enter the fray and enter the mix here, I feel like we'll start to see that more even as Mars does move into Gemini and perfects this trine to Pluto. So again, this is going to introduce, especially with Pluto in Aquarius, a bit more of that inventive, innovative, breakthrough kind of energy. Could also bring power grid influences, like I said, internet, issues like that into the mix, hopefully in a way that isn't very disruptive, but it could potentially be, or it could be innovations on any of those fronts, you know. These sextiles are somewhat relieving, I feel. The reason for that is that with Neptune, there's a sense here that ideas can come in again in these really weird and unexpected ways. You may even come up with an idea based on some random lyric or some random song that you don't even like that was playing in a grocery store or something like that. Like things can come completely out of left field. They could come in through sleep. They could come in through daydreaming and something just kind of hits you, hopefully not literally, you know. But there's a real left field energy coming from Neptune here, and Neptune is overcoming within this aspect in terms of the kind of Hellenistic technique of who's behind who and who is kind of influencing the aspect more. Neptune is in a power position here, as is Pluto. So these two far outer planets are really pushing their influence into this, which is making this again kind of more of a masses influence in terms of innovations, inventions that could come to individual people, but this is really going to be basically a vibe, for lack of a better term, that is going to be felt generally, and then it's going to also play out probably in events that will affect large groups of people, but again, potentially not everyone, so don't worry too much about it. There's also going to be, with the sextile to the Sun, again, that kind of urge for freedom, that urge for self-expression that is not restrained, for physical activity. You will probably have a lot of energy during this time, possibly too much energy, you know, and you may really feel an urge that is deep for a healthy means of getting that energy expressed out of your body so that it's not feeling like it's cooped up within that corpus, which is such a weird kind of energy that's coming through with this conjunction here, you know. Maybe the body is where the energy dies here, so don't keep it cooped up within your body, let it out, find an expression for it, you know. Now, we also do have this square that's building up. This is going to play in big time to the opposition from the moon that's popping up the next day. That's actually going to form a T-square between the moon opposite to Mars-Uranus, and then both of them are going to be square to Mercury. So the way that could play out, and the way that all of this really could play out potentially, is arguments and harsh arguments. So this could come through in a strong sense of stubbornness, really not seeing eye to eye with other people and refusing to get on the same page. There is all of the energy that was like cooperative and beautiful and lovely and compassionate that has been playing out. It's really not quite as present. The only real aspect that we have that's still applying from Neptune on a personal level in terms of personal planets is the sun. So this is going to be self-compassion. It's you're not going to really be wanting to deal with other people's, crap during this time. And as I emphasized during the monthly forecast, there's a major warning here to watch your words. There are potential really bad with the star influence, this algal influence. There are potential really not great consequences for speaking very roughly and rudely out of turn, and also for offending others. One thing that with the archetype of Medusa, I'm trying to slow down here and take some water. One thing with Medusa is the reason that her hair was turned into snakes was, if I'm remembering correctly, there was some Titan drama around the fact that she had some children with Neptune. I don't really know how all of that played out, but that is kind of interesting that we have then this applying sextile to Neptune here from these planets on algal. But basically, her hair was turned into snakes because she was considered really beautiful, and she had this somehow it was a transgression to have children with Neptune. I don't remember why, and so her hair was turned into snakes, and then she, would strike fear in the hearts of anyone who looked at her because of her hair. So her beauty turned into this great, grotesque kind of uh, problem for people. And then Perseus then beheaded her within this kind of myth. So, and that was considered this great, thank God she's beheaded, which I don't remember the entire story, but it seems very much like a Lilith style story of, for some reason, she transgressed in a way that is not, you know, readily apparent to a modern mind, and then, basically had to be, brutalized. But that is a lot of the energy that comes through with the stars is that kind of brutality. So was that an influence of Medusa, or was that an influence of the reaction to Medusa? So I would really watch out for offending people, even accidentally, because there could be some consequences. Let's go with this whole archetype and myth, and say that um, Medusa was treated unjustly. Well, then that's potentially also an influence here of there could even be unjust consequences that don't really make sense, just because someone has been offended by your completely okay actions. So I would be a little careful about this this urge that you have to be so openly expressive about yourself coming up against other people. If it does, I would try not to make a bigger issue out of it than it already is. Like, I wouldn't fight about it. I would be like, okay, well, that sounds like a you problem, and then carry on with, your own self. So I would try not to get into those kind of heated issues with people, and try not to stoke up the energy because it's already going to be high. So yeah, potential major arguments, hurt feelings, offense taken, but then with this, potential consequences. So that's what I would really watch out for, especially since this is a Saturnian decan here that we're dealing with. Saturn deals with consequences to things, and we do also have this in conjunct of consequences. 19 degrees of Pisces to 19 degrees of Leo is a quincunx in conjunct aspect here. Potential major consequences for causing discomfort with one's expression. is how that plays out. So that is mostly what I have for this instance. I wanted to look at some of these past instances because they're quite fascinating. So back in 1942, we also had a late degree. Is this? Heck yeah. All right. I was so focused in on trying to narrow this in and trying to figure out exactly what time, what day this all played out, that I didn't realize it's actually at exactly the same degree. It's like 20 minutes difference, 19 minutes off. So this took place in exactly the same part of the sky as is the one that's playing out now. I put this for Jakarta because that is the area where this was most interesting. I could have also put this for um, Los Angeles because it played out in a really interesting way there as well. But so this was late in the evening in Jakarta where this actually played out. And notice that in this chart, for the region of Indonesia and broader everywhere that this house system would hold, we have these two planets have just moved in. I want to say that this ascendant is around, let me pull up displayed points, pull in the ascendant and the midheaven. Yeah, it's a really early ascendant here. So these houses just changed and it just put this rough, rough energy, this kind of explosive energy, this major change oriented and conflictual energy that is associated with brutality and violence and shocks, upsets, um, the fear that can be stricken in the heart. All of that was placed in the seventh house from the Indonesian perspective, as well as broadly speaking, again, anywhere that this ascendant would hold, which is that kind of pushing East Asia area. During this time, what we have going on big time is a lot of movement in the Pacific theater of World War II. And there was a huge fight over the Dutch East Indies during this whole period of time. There was basically Japanese victory after Japanese victory. It was completely one-sided in the Pacific theater during this time. And we do see Japan taking over these islands. I'm not 100% familiar with all of the different islands of Indonesia and how they all fell, but they took over this area during this time. And one thing that's fascinating is during this time there were a few weird, for some reason, changes in media in short succession. So Voice of America popped up right around this time. And by right around this time, I mean, I'm giving a few month range of time for this because these big aspects like this can play out in the time all leading up. Mars probably would have popped into the sign 1 month prior, so that would have been full effect. And then also for some time after, you can see some of the effects. But Voice of America popped up for the first time with shortwave radio outside of the country. So over, I think it was in German at the time. And there was an issue where there was a cartoon in the Daily Mirror that offended Churchill. And so he was considering banning the Daily Mirror, which, we may have opinions about the Daily Mirror right now, but it's just like such a weird kind of random thing that it would pop up, as well as when the location of this one, I don't know which city it was in, this Dutch Indonesian radio station that would broadcast, because Indonesia was controlled by the Dutch previous to this, would broadcast in both Dutch as well as local languages. They were about to be taken over geographically, and so they basically just shut it down. The Japanese said, just carry on as you will. And they were like, we're just going to tell everyone, hey, good luck, and we'll see you later. And then they played like the Dutch national anthem, which is just, it's so weird with all of these kind of Voice of America being like, a voice for people who were against the Nazi regime, but has also represented its own form of, kind of complicated, um, propaganda and influence over other countries where, the US probably shouldn't be exerting its influence all the time. And then with Churchill trying to exert an influence that he shouldn't really have over what the Daily Mirror is publishing, but what they published was stupid anyway, and also the Daily Mirror kind of sucks, but um, and then with this kind of Dutch Indonesian, somewhat local, somewhat colonial kind of, radio station being represented here, and then it somehow looking like this beacon of freedom as the kind of imperial Japanese military came in to take over. There's just such a twisted, again, kind of grotesque manner that this has played out in this degree with the media, and it's also fascinating with the perception of grotesqueness of the last debate that just happened as well, and the kind of weird way that media seems to be playing a lot of different sides of, for instance, this kind of question of whether Biden should run or shouldn't run. It's really playing out in a pretty gross way where people are vying for their own power. They're vying to be on the side that turns out to be correct in this issue that probably hasn't quite been decided yet, but is really uncomfortable for like everyone involved, and all of the different sides of that are a little bit grotesque in and of themselves, as they're trying to deal with something that people have found rather off-putting recently as well. Um, and all of that, of course, playing out through the media and these kind of questions of power of media coming through during this time as well. And that'll come up again in the next transit that we see from 1857. So yeah, we have the fighting over the quote Dusty Dutch East Indies, colonial crap, and then imperial powers coming in to further screw over the actual native people of the area. There was something fascinating as well with, so there was during this time this bombardment by Japanese submarines, I think, of Elwood in the Los Angeles area of California, which is so fascinating because, I one of my first fascinations when I was like 12 years old, I got super into the Pacific War. Um, and I'm sure that I ran across this, but it was only when I was looking back, like, okay, what happened during this time, that I kind of realized that there was an actual fear of invasion, from Japan to the US, because we don't really focus on that a lot, which is unfortunate because it's tied up into the whole issue of the internment that wound up taking place with Japanese Americans. But there was an actual Japanese bombardment, not just of Pearl Harbor, but also of the mainland of the US. And it was basically inconsequential, but it was genuinely deeply scary. And then it played out in terms of what's called the Battle of Los Angeles, which is like this really stupid thing. Again, there's a lot of like really stupid energy that comes through with a lot of this crap too, like just dumb decisions and just ridiculous, like clownish kind of people making these weird kind of decisions. And of course, we can see a lot of that playing out today as well. But basically, the US military kind of freaked out because of the bombardment of Elwood, which was basically inconsequential and wasn't going to develop into anything, but was just a little bit scary and interesting. And so there was like this basically bombardment that also seemed inconsequential. I don't think people were really hurt by this, but there was a bunch of like bombs or whatever that the US sent up in response to this, but it all played out basically just in Los Angeles. And I'm not sure what they were trying to really accomplish other than that they were just freaking out, in a way that didn't really make a lot of sense. And then the fear again that was stoked by the kind of specter of, oh wait, no, they can actually hit the mainland, and they have now, that sadly led to again a real fear turning into a bullshit response of the internment of Japanese Americans when the original thing didn't even have any real consequence, but it did in turn because of the reaction to it. So that is one thing that I'm seeing pop up with this a lot is really interesting reactions to things that were crap to begin with and weren't cool, but then making the situation kind of worse with the reaction to it. So there was also a lot of exchange between the Manhattan Project head, I forget his name, and Roosevelt over the atomic bomb. So it was shortly before this, they were given the go ahead basically to pursue the bomb, and then there was almost to the day, I think, a message or a discussion between the head of the program and Roosevelt about the fact that they thought that it was really going to be possible to do it then as they were continuing to look into it. So that's mostly what I have for the 1942 situation. Again, we have this really power hungry lose lose kind of situation playing out with Pluto on the midheaven here, from the perspective again of Indonesia and the Pacific War. For a lot of the islands that were being screwed over during this time, it was basically like, the devil you know or the devil you don't, basically. So yeah, that's mostly what I am seeing there. We also have the sun then, this kind of crap adventuring energy here with the sun in the fifth of, in a mundane chart, the fifth represents speculation, yes, but also militaries and so forth. And then having this war energy as the others, and with Saturn during this time, because during this conjunction, Saturn was also in the mix, and they were also in Saturn's decan. That was a strongly oppressive force from others that was martial, and it couldn't be predicted well, the way that things were going to play out for the actual people that had to be around for this kind of stuff that was playing out there during that time. So let's go back more now. I've mentioned actually this time in connection with something else that's in this chart, which is interesting. 1857 is popping up a lot. The 1857 to 1858 time period is weirdly relevant for today, and we'll go into that a little bit more. I mentioned it, I think, in the monthly as well. I put this one as DC in part because some of this has to do with Dred Scott, and I guess the Supreme Court was at the Capitol building during this time. So yeah, so we have the 6th of May during this time. And what we have in Taurus is a lot of stuff. So we have this taking place at 24 degrees, still in that third decan. We have Venus with this a bit. So there's more of a straightforward cause involved here than there have been. Sorry, it's raining outside now. Than there have been in the very last one we dealt with, and then the one that we're dealing with now. Venus is in its own sign, and of course, since this is all playing out within Taurus, Venus does rule this. We have the Sun, and then we also have Pluto in the mix, but Pluto's pretty far off. These are all just kind of generally playing into the whole situation. I noticed that this is within the 8th house of issues of other people's resources and debts that haven't been paid and so forth. So let us dive into this a bit. This I could have also put for India, because this also took place during the Indian Rebellion of 1857. And that was one thing that I don't think I've mentioned it at all yet with regard to this. One thing that Taurus often also brings up is issues regarding, quote, like bestial animals. So especially like hooved creatures, farm animals, definitely cows and livestock, and all of that play out weirdly strongly in the sign of Taurus. And this particular Indian rebellion of 1857, obviously there were a lot of efforts to try and throw off, the British yoke. But this one in particular was triggered by the fact that the armed forces that were almost like weirdly contracted, I think, to the is it the East India Corporation? I'm for some reason blanking on the name of that company that we all know about. Um, they were they had these, like, I guess, contract companies that were either contracted to them or they were contracted to the crown or whatever, and they were basically local people. And there was an innovation with ammunition during this time, where the new type of ammunition that they were then going to be working with, you had to bite it open before you were working with the shell. So you would bite it open and then load it up, and then you could utilize the shells. If you can't tell, I don't know anything about ammunition, but what the issue was with this is that with this innovation of ammunition, there was animal fat that was involved in the actual shell. And so you would have to bite the shell off, and there was animal fat that would then presumably get into your mouth a little bit. And you would either have to use beef tallow, or you would have to use lard coming from pigs. And this is India. So the population is Hindu or Muslim for the most part, and they're going to have issues with either the lard or the beef tallow. And so I thought that was just incredibly fascinating, that kind of rebellion, which is definitely represented by this, would play out with that Taurus energy of issues of livestock, and especially cows and bulls and so forth, but bestial animals generally really coming through with that. We also have during this time the first international financial panic. So this is the panic of 1857. And so much of this is so Taurus related. It's very fascinating. So this was, again, we have a media innovation issue coming up. This was the first international panic because of the fact that it was the first panic that occurred during the time after the telegraph was invented. So it was basically able to be telegraphed everywhere, each precarious step of the way. So all of it was continually being communicated, and there was a huge speculative market during the time, probably in part because of the fact that you were able to communicate so much more quickly the prices of things, and who's buying and who's selling and everything. So a couple of the things that triggered this was that the sterling seemed to, despite the fact that it was legally required to be backed by gold and silver, it looked like there was some sort of loophole that was being used, and so it wasn't quite as backed by gold and silver as you would expect. This again, not only the financial aspect, which is Taurus, but also the fact that you would want to have the monetary value of what you're exchanging be grounded in these earthen, metals of gold and silver, and to be real, to be tangible in terms of a an amount of value, a holding of value. That was part of it. There was also a flour company, which is again this kind of agricultural earthen kind of company that wound up going under, and it was like the biggest that was in the whole, like, I think eastern U.S. region. Kind of suddenly went under. There was also issues around the land and rail markets, which again are also things that are on the ground. The land is the ground, the rail goes on the ground. It was issues with those markets and too high of speculation from the UK in our rail and our land, that in the US, I say, that was part of the trigger for all of this. And this actually led to a pretty big issue. There wasn't a real recovery from this until the Civil War. And so it wasn't this bad. It wasn't a full on panic the whole time, but there was limited credit available because of the panic and the freak out and the kind of like, we don't really know which way the economy is going right now, so let's hold back. There was limited credit available in the years between this time and then the Civil War. Now, again, we do have the whole lead up to the Civil War playing out during this time. Back in March, a couple months before this, I think it was actually March 6th, was the Dred Scott decision, which called into question the Missouri Compromise, where states that were above a specific latitude, I think it's like 3630 or something like that. Those would be free states, and then those below could be slave states. Basically, the decision that came down claimed that compromise, which went through with legislation, was not constitutional. And so it basically called into question the entire system of compromise that had been established, on which the kind of shaky peace that would be the lead up to the Civil War. That was the basis on which it was standing, and then that was kind of ripped out from under it with the decision that was made on the Dred Scott case. Now, Dred Scott himself, if you're not familiar with the case, this was the one where there was a man who was held as a slave. The people that enslaved him lived in Missouri and had him in Missouri, and then there was a time where they went to, it was either Illinois or Wisconsin, or something like that, somewhere around there. It was a northern state in the Midwest. They brought him with them, and they lived there for 4 years, and then they moved back. And the case was brought around the fact that when Dred Scott was living in this northern state, that he should have been freed at that point because slavery wasn't legal in that state. And the insane, I think his name was Talley or something, the Chief Justice at the time, his decision was completely insane, basically said that no, someone who is a slave doesn't have any rights anywhere, even if they go to a free state, and that the federal government doesn't have the right to decide um, whether a state is allowed to have slavery or not anyway. So basically, that just led straight into all of the issues that within a couple years would turn into the Civil War. Dred Scott himself was actually, I think he was bought by someone in a kind of humane act where they bought him and then they freed him. I don't think it was the original family that wound up freeing him, like right around this date. Um, so his part that he had to play in unsettling the situation so that it could be dealt with, once and for all, had played out in March, and then, by the time this actually occurred, he was freed, but not based on the decision. The way I'm looking at this is he played out a very fated, role for the country of bringing this case. And then once the case played out the way that it did, in such a way that kind of wound up having to lead to the Civil War, so that the whole situation could really be decided once and for all, and we wouldn't have any slave states anymore, then his whole situation there just kind of had to play out the way that it did. And once it did, then it was like, well, some real strong good karma coming through. This is also the period of Bleeding Kansas. So John Brown and his whole crew was raising a ruckus for a good cause for some years leading up to all of this, and this was basically just kind of the continuation of that. But I did want to point out that during the whole time that Uranus was moving through Taurus, um, and again, Taurus having to do with resources, with finances, with, sadly, I hate to say, issues of these concepts of living things as property, with the Taurus archetype of the bull as well. That was really playing out in a rebellious way around this time, around a good cause, and so during this time as well, we see that represented by the fact that this is all ruled by Venus, and Venus is in its own sign, um, and actually during this time, Venus is even retrograde, so she's very, very strong there. Now, we also have some other like stupid nonsense playing out with the Utah war in the US. A lot of the stuff that was playing out during this time was in the US and India. So we had, during this time, this was like the federal government versus the Mormons that were in Utah. And this kind of also included some of the issues around the Missouri Compromise, and some worry about whether the fact that the compromise was considered unconstitutional, what that meant for the future slave statuses of the territories, because Utah was not yet, I think, a state at this point. I don't think. But basically, it was the federal government was having to come in to make sure that this kind of rowdy, very weird group of people, that there were pros and cons, and it was just very weird, and kind of, I mean, I think a lot of us in the US look at this kind of generation of this particular group of all of the kind of strange Protestant denominations that have arisen in this country, um, as relatively grotesque. I mean, these were people who went out, obviously, into native lands, demonized the hell out of native people, claimed that they should, of course, be able to enslave them and should be able to enslave Black people. And they were polygamists, and on the other hand, had these weird kind of egalitarian economic perspectives with regard, at least to white Mormons, where they had these like kind of communes and stuff that they were living in. So it's all just like very weird. It's something that isn't super pleasant to look at or think about, but had a big impact on the way that these territories as well as the states all would wind up playing out in a few years in the Civil War. So a lot of like war and violent crap playing out, a lot of panic, like weird panics playing out. So the Panic of 1857, as well as the Panic of the Battle of Los Angeles. Um, Media innovations with the telegraph, and then these kind of strange dramas around um, the radio and newspapers in 42. This kind of, rebellion for a cause kind of situation. There was, the fact that they played the Dutch national anthem was this kind of on the radio just before the Japanese were taking over. It was an act of rebellion, against what they knew was coming and against the stronger power at the time, because Japan was really kind of, owning the whole field at the time. So, and then of course this rebellion for a cause being, I mean, that's what John Brown is entirely known for. It's just very interesting. There's also this innovation that I'm just now seeing in weaponry that we're seeing with, of course, yeah, that's how it would play out because it's Uranus Mars. So this is what I love about going through these things on the channel is I realize things that I wouldn't have if I hadn't, just spoken about it casually like this. But so we have the approvals for the atom bomb and the kind of prototyping and everything with that in 42, and then in 57 the Indian Rebellion was triggered by this innovation in the ammunition at the time that required animal fat in order for the shells to work, I guess. Um, so it's all very fascinating the way that all of this plays out. And we can see, of course, kind of echoes of situations like this playing out now. I don't really want to know what kind of innovations and weaponry are playing out during this time, but I'm sure that we will in terms of artificial intelligence and robotics being involved more and more in war making and these kind of violent, repressive apparatuses that are available. And again, we have these kind of grotesque issues that we don't really want to look at, like the whole Utah war situation, as well as the kind of fighting between these kind of gross powers in, the Pacific theater, where it was just basically a lose-lose situation. Same thing with the Utah war. It's kind of like a lose-lose as far as that goes. It's all very fascinating. Again, we see that really playing out this year with the whole lose-lose situation, like with the fact that we have this election coming up, and it's the two people that the most Americans least wanted to see running, during this time. And it's like this train wreck that you kind of can't look away from, and yet you don't even want to lay eyes on it anyway because it's all kind of gross. So there's this kind of weird, yucky feeling that seems to kind of come up with this transit each time. But yes, so let us come out of this. So that is what we have for Mars conjunct Uranus. Again, if you appreciate this kind of content, then do please feel free to stick around by hitting the subscribe button. and joining our new little community here. I would love to have you here for future episodes. And yeah, until then, stay safe during this transit, and I hope to see you super soon in another episode. Bye.